In the course of the last few days, there have been some, what people have been calling, promising developments for Yemen after UN brokered peace talks, the first they've been in 2 years. A ceasefire in the port city of Hodeidah, reopening Sanaa's airport and a prisoner swap deal were all apparently agreed. The question now is whether the deal can hold, and if it can it lead to longer lasting peace? Very good to have your company. You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. A United Nations report that points to possible war crimes by both sides in the conflict was instrumental in bringing them together for these talks. In our previous show, we looked at what Yemen needs in terms of humanitarian assistance. In this, the second part, we ask if aid is only a short-term fix when there are much more fundamental problems.
Yemen has been ravaged by a multi-sided conflict since 2014. The Iranian-backed Houthi rebels and the Saudi-backed Yemeni government entered direct negotiations this month. Mediated by the United Nations, the talks were the first in 2 years. After a week of discussions, the biggest breakthrough was a ceasefire at the port city of Hodeidah, a principal lifeline for 2/3 of the country.
The UN will play a leading role in the ports, and this will facilitate humanitarian access and the flow of goods to the civilian population.
When they meet again in January, will more progress be made towards peace?
And I'm pleased to say that joining us from Beirut, we have Sami Nader, the director of the Levant Institute for Strategic Affairs here in the studio, Hamdan Dammag, Vice President of the Yemen Center for Studies and Research, and Charles Garraway with us from the previous program, staying on for this one, who co-authored the UN's group of experts report on Yemen. And Sami Hamdi is also here, the editor of International Interest. Very warm welcome to each one of you. Sami Nader, let me come to you first of all. Do you hold out any hope for these talks?
I think up to now the result is not great on the ground, although what has been achieved is a great success or a great breakthrough. However, I think that the main weak point is that the United Nations now has to play a role in enforcing this agreement between the warring parties. Up to now, the United Nations does not put the mechanism that is needed to enforce this decision. I think the next step should be, based on this agreement, a resolution of the Security Council, and why not under Chapter 7, in order to enforce the implementation of this agreement. And unless we have this kind of mechanism, this kind of strong engagement of the international community, what has been achieved up to now will remain wishful thinking, because what is at stake for the warring parties is very high, especially when it comes to Hodeidah, for the forces backed by the government. This is a turning point, turning strategic point. They were about to win this battle. And for the Houthis, losing Hodeidah means losing the whole war, and the tilt of the balance of power to their detriment.
I want to point out to those who didn't see the first part of our program that Hodeidah is a port on the western side of the country that is absolutely essential for bringing in aid supplies, for bringing in food and water. It's the busiest port. And the other talk is of reopening Sanaa, the capital's airport. So these are strategically important in terms of alleviating the suffering. Charles, what do you make of the point that Sami says here, that it's not just crucial for the reasons I've just outlined, but it's also crucial to the way this conflict goes?
We, as a group of experts, have not been directly involved in, if you like, the political side of the agreements. Our role has been based from Geneva, operating on looking at violations of international law. However, if there is to be any relief for the people of Yemen, there has got to be a ceasing of hostilities. Because, as we saw in the previous program, you cannot get the humanitarian aid in. you cannot start to rebuild the economy of Yemen until the hostilities have ceased. And so, yes, the two are inextricably linked.
Sami, do you want to comment on where you think the power has ebbed and flowed in this? And if the hostilities were to end in particular areas and we could get a peace at this time, who right now has the upper hand? Anybody?
I think, David, what we have to be aware of, we have to understand why this agreement came about, in the sense that why did the Houthis this time, after former negotiations where they haven't been able to agree, whether it's the national dialogue, whether it's in Geneva, whether it's refusing the UN resolution of 2216 in terms of surrendering weapons, why now did they give these compromises? There's only one thing that would make the Houthis compromise on anything. The fact that they might be losing, the fact that the military tide is finally moving against them. I've been saying since the beginning of the war, only one thing makes the Houthis back down, and that is military force. Anwar Gargash...
Is it not also possible that the Saudis felt that they had to engage in this, the Saudis and their partners, the United Arab Emirates, because the spotlight had been turned on them to some extent by their involvement in the Khashoggi killing, which made them feel a little bit more vulnerable, and therefore they had to sort of back down in this area?
But when you look at the terms of the agreement that is taking place, the port being removed from Houthi control and going to United Nations control, the idea that the proceeds will go to the central bank, even though it hasn't been determined which central bank, the one in Sanaa or the one in Aden, these are terms that the Houthis would have felt a lot of pain in having to give up. Because Hodeidah is a vital lifeline. It's where all of their supplies come, most of their supplies come through in order for them to continue this particular war. But we should be wary how we exaggerate this discussion, this negotiation, because there is something very serious we have to address.
We mustn't build it up too much.
We must, but not because it might fail, because it doesn't address the key issue here. The key issue in Yemen is this. All parties came to an agreement on a government. This government was Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi. Houthis took up the weapons and they stormed the capital and kicked out this government. The problem for United Nations is this. If you give too many concessions to the Houthis, or if you're seen to be acknowledging Houthi as an equal party to the government, what you do is when you finally have a peace agreement for Sanaa that gives Houthis their concessions, Yemen is a tribal society. Tomorrow we will have Islah, they will take a few cities, Russia will bomb to defend the Houthis, the UN will come in and say humanitarian crisis, humanitarian crisis.
Well, it already is a humanitarian crisis. Hamdan, I want to ask you, I mean, they talk about, various commentators say, the civil war that's been going on for 3 and a bit years. I can remember reporting on trouble in Yemen going back for 10 years, I would say. And certainly it escalated sort of around about the same time as the Arab Spring of 2011. Was it always inevitable that it would get to this particular point? You were in the country from what I think 2005 to 2012, had to leave for a bit, then went back again. Did you see this situation emerging?
Not really, no. As you said, we always have problems in Yemen, especially in the during the Arab Spring. But we must also remember that we came out of this chaos in a good way. We managed to conduct a dialogue that has never been before in Yemen. And
this is the national dialogue that's the national dialogue referring to that didn't succeed.
Yeah,
all parties agreed on.
Yeah, and the importance of this is that for the first time in the history of Yemen, that all different factions of the society came and they spoke about issues that we have never dared to speak about before. And I think it was very important that everyone was involved, including Houthis as well. So the outcome of this dialogue is very important, and I think it is a start.
Well, the outcome of this dialogue is that we have one of the worst civil wars and humanitarian crises in the world.
That's true, because it was a turning point in the history of Yemen. And I think those who thought they will lose their power and the share of the wealth, they decided not to go along with this, which namely Houthi and the previous president, Ali Abdullah Saleh. And I think this is when they had this military coup and they took Sanaa.
So let's go to Beirut, and I'll ask Sami Nader there. Therefore, the problems of Yemen are perhaps intractable. Even if the guns stop firing and the planes stop dropping their bombs at the moment, it's going to take a great deal more than that to resolve the country's differences. Am I right?
Not totally, because the conflict is not only a domestic conflict, it's chiefly an international or regional one. What's happening in Yemen is similar to what's happening in Syria and to a lesser extent in Iraq and Lebanon. The domestic conflict took a regional dimension with the involvement of Iran and the face-off between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The turning point in Yemen, in my view, was not the fact that the internal balance has been disrupted in favor of the Houthi. It's the fact that the Houthi were totally equipped and supported by Iran, and the tipping point or the turning point was when Saudi Arabia started to be hit by ballistic missile or the Houthi missile that were provided or at least equipped and trained by Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy. This is why, in order to consolidate this truce in Yemen or this ceasefire, there is an arrangement to be found directly or indirectly between two major regional powers, Saudi and Arabia and Iran. Now, both countries have welcomed the ceasefire, actually, and this what triggered hope on the international scene that this conflict may end. However, the events in the last 2 days don't show this or don't provide this any evidence that this conflict could end up very soon.
I think
maybe
you're referring to the fact that
is still
the fighting hasn't
on changing.
Yeah, I think you're referring to the fact that the fighting hasn't entirely ended, so we'll have to wait and see on that one. Very clear from Sami Nader there that it is, on the one hand, a proxy war fought by Iran using the Houthis, and the Saudis are using the government, or both sides are being manipulated by outside forces. And yet in your report, let me ask you this, because just to make it clear, you do mention Saudi Arabia 28 times. I counted it. You don't mention Iran once.
Yes, that is correct. And the reason is that the UN is approaching this with a three-pronged approach. The first is the political side, which is being dealt with by Martin Griffiths in Stockholm, as we have seen. The second, which we haven't really mentioned very much, is Security Council Resolution 2216, the arms embargo, and the verification mission, which includes a panel of experts, a separate panel of experts, which is looking at weapons. And our role, which comes out of Geneva from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, looking at violations, in particular of human rights law and the law of armed conflict.
And we're talking about, among other things here, we're talking about torture, detention, ill treatment, etc., etc.
That's right. So what we've been trying to do is not to cover, not to overlap too much.
But can I just ask you this one? If it is about the human rights issues, is that to say, because you mentioned Saudi Arabia so many times, that only they have committed human rights abuses, and that the Iranian-backed side have not done this, in your opinion, or are you sort of pushing that away?
Far from it. I don't think you said how many times we cited the Houthis.
I think it was about 5 or 6.
Or I think a lot more than that. And
it certainly wasn't anywhere near 28.
Also, how many times we cited the United Arab Emirates, who are another party who are particularly involved on the ground. And they, in fact, have been running many of the detention centres in the south, which are ostensibly under government control, but in fact the government claimed to have no control over whatsoever.
So let's move on to where we are at the moment. Sorry if I got the wrong number there, but I mean, you certainly don't mention Iran. Let's move on to what's been happening in the United States. Outside pressure. I mentioned Khashoggi earlier on, and the exposing, if you like, of what Saudi Arabia has done and the pressure that may well have put on it internationally, the spotlight at least. What about the fact that the US Senate has now said to Mr. Trump, look, we don't want you to pursue this, and they've said to Saudi Arabia, look, I'm sorry, you can't go around behaving like this everywhere. Is that going to make any difference whatsoever?
I don't think it ever really makes a difference on US foreign policy in the Middle East. That seems to be an independent arm of the US. Irrespective of what happens domestically, the US has some sort of system that takes place in the Middle East with very different rules. You've actually said something very dangerous earlier, David, when you said that, you know, the national dialogue, and we've seen the outcome of that, and it's brought war. The outcome of the national dialogue did not bring the war. What brought the war was the failure to uphold the national national dialogue by the United Nations, by the international community. When Houthi entered Jawf and Amran, there was no response. When he entered Sanaa, John Kerry said they could be a viable partner in combating terrorism. When they entered Ta'iz, Lahj and Dhala, there was no reaction whatsoever. There was, in the embassies, the Western embassies, they said Hadi has a gun to his head, we don't know exactly what to do. When Houthi got to the gates of Aden, the last stronghold, Yemen was about to become completely under the Houthis, the Saudis went, what on earth is going on here? Have you guys just allowed Iran to have a new proxy on my southern border, in addition to the northern border, and the eastern border, and Lebanon, and the like? It was the failure, as Sami said earlier, for there to be a mechanism to uphold the national dialogue. This war that is taking place in Yemen...
I simply said I think it had failed.
No, it hadn't failed. The national dialogue was successful in that it was the first time, as Hamdan
well,
said...
if it had succeeded, Sami, with all due respect, we wouldn't be where we are now. Okay, are you going to see in your country splits geographically to solve this? Is what is going to be needed? That we go back to the North and South Yemen, which there was, I mean, gosh, we're not so many years ago. Or are we going to see further splits?
Well, I hope not. And even the matter of South and North is not that easy. It's very complicated. The South is not united in one single form of government. You have Hadramaut, they are not willing to be part of any new South. And you have the North, the unspoken people, the majority, they still don't have clear idea of whether they will accept a separation or not. It's very complicated, and I think if we go this road, what we will see is an endless cycle of violence for 10 of years. I think preserving the unity of Yemen as it is now is a key issue, because this is what all Yemenis are united.
Keeping it as one country.
Yes, and then if stability reached, and then a political process started again, and people started to talk to each other, I think even if there are claim of any kind of form of local governance or something like this, then this will happen. If you separate the country during a civil war, it is an endless war.
Okay, Sami, Nader, do you agree with the other Sami's point that no matter what is said in US domestic politics, it's really going to make no difference to US foreign policy, and that therefore the Senate vote is largely symbolic and sort of can best be ignored in the larger scale of things?
Maybe not totally inefficient, but one has to take into consideration as well how much strategic is Bab al-Mandab Strait, not only for Saudi Arabia, but chiefly to Western countries, Great Britain, US major allies. More than 60% of the oil that is channeled to Great Britain go through Bab al-Mandab. So what is at stake, it's not only a domestic war, it's not only a regional conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but what is at stake as well is something related to the energy markets and to the direct interest of major international powers too. And I do believe that the American administration take this into consideration. They have, on one hand, to protect their alliance with Saudi Arabia because they are going through a very tough time challenging or confronting Iran. This is on the one hand. There is the security of the oil prices, which is of prime interest for United States, and as well the direct interest of other allies. It's true that the Khashoggi case in a way pressured or had an impact on the public opinion and on some key institutions in the States, but national and the national interest of Washington dictate a policy that has to conserve and defend its strong ties with Saudi Arabia.
How about this? We expand it even further. We're talking about economic security to some extent, because we've referred to the oil fields here. Large parts of the oil field territory in Yemen are controlled by AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, who have operated, because of the chaos in the rest of the country, pretty much undisturbed for the last 4+ years. They've been consolidating their position in the south of Yemen. All right, other oil fields are held by different parties, but that is one area. It is an added concern on the international level, is it not? Charles, do you want to say something about that?
Yes, I'm not sure exactly to what extent AQAP do control as much as you seem to think they do. And this is where the United Arab Emirates have come in with their ground forces and with forces they have equipped Yemeni forces, and they've equipped and controlled. And they have got quite a sizable hold on the east of the country in support.
So they've been able to come down over the land itself?
Not over land,
no.
not the UAE.
Well, they could go through Oman.
They could go through Oman, but I don't know if they are going through Oman. But
and you think they've successfully been able to sort of, if not neutralise, then certainly limit the progression of AQAP?
Certainly, I think the AQAP role is less than perhaps you think.
So, Sami, Nader, if we were to look for positive signs in the weeks to come, what would you suggest we keep our eyes open for?
I think one has to keep an eye on Houthi in Al-Hodeidah. Will they withdraw or not? Or they were using this ceasefire in order to consolidate their position. There is no doubt if the Houthi were not under pressure and were about to lose Hodeidah, maybe they didn't go into this agreement. The second point, which is more important, I do believe, is how much strong will be the commitment of the UN Security Council in order to enforce the implementation of this agreement. Sending observers only is not enough. Let's be very clear about it. At one point, you need a substantial force in order to take control of Al-Hodeidah port. This is key. And once Al-Hodeidah port is under real control of the United Nations, I think at that point one could hope for an end of hostility in Yemen, and this agreement has the chance to hold, because it will secure the Bab al-Mandab trade, and it will be a first step towards normalization in Yemen.
Sami, Nader, we thank you very much indeed. Hamdan, I saw you sort of nodding in agreement with that. So we need not a UN monitoring force, we really need a UN peacekeeping force.
No, I disagree with this. I don't think, I spoke to many Yemeni friends in Yemen the last 3-4 days, and the idea of having peacekeeping forces, not only monitors, are not going to be popular in Yemen, because they will see this as a foreign invasion. This is
how do you keep any kind of peace without?
I think we should be very careful before we make any resolution to send any military presence to add more into what's going on. I think we should allow more time for the warring parties to implement what they have agreed in Sweden, and then we look at it from then.
But that seems a little bit like it's going to be an impossible task. You ask the two fighting parties to stop fighting one another while we see how well they get on, and then you put in somebody, once they've stopped fighting one another, to make sure that they don't do it again. Surely the time to do it, to make sure the sides are kept apart, would be as soon as somebody says, let's look, we've got the basis of a deal, we've got people in there to make sure you don't kill each other.
No, my point is I think people, because the two warring parties agreed on sending monitors to observe and to observe the ceasefire and the withdrawal from Hodeidah, and I think anything additional than what they have agreed is not guaranteed that they will accept it, first of all. Second, the people will not like to see any more military presence coming to the equation. I think let's make hope, and that they we were told that they will implement the ceasefire tomorrow. So let's wait until
let's bring in Charles. You talk about the three-pronged UN approach here.
Yes.
You may want to add something to that, but my question is the same as it was to the Hamdan. How can this be done without a peacekeeping force?
That's a very good question, but there is an interesting clause in the agreement. And I've looked at the agreement on Hodeidah, and it refers to the controlling of security by the forces operating under the law of Yemen. So they are clearly looking in the agreement at Yemeni forces controlling security within the port area. Now, how that works out on the ground, I don't know, but it's going to mean that both sides have got to come together and work that out. But clearly there is envisaged a UN presence in the port.
Perhaps as a monitoring.
To run the port,
Yeah.
certainly. And because there is also provision allowed for the monitoring system, which is currently operated by the UN under Security Council Resolution 2216, to be extended into the port of Hodeidah.
You
So
are
it's clearly
a military lawyer, and you look at the fine print. It's the bigger. Sami, I wish I had more time. We will talk independently away from the microphone. And Hamdan, thank you very much indeed. Baby steps, perhaps, when it comes to ending the conflict in Yemen, but some steps at least. And as our guest from Beirut pointed out, perhaps the one thing to look for is to see whether, in fact, hostilities in Hodeidah do cease and whether that can be maintained if indeed it does happen. Thank you for watching. If you watched our first part, which was all about the humanitarian problems in Yemen, thank you very much indeed. If not, you can find it on YouTube Roundtable, TRT World. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being on the program. Goodbye for now.